Good evening, everyone, and welcome for today's session at Shield Art Initiative. And just to introduce briefly about Shield Art, because many of you don't know, it is a non-profit initiative which has been working for last 5-6 years, and it started founded by me with some of the artist friends, and we all are working voluntarily for them, and other artists, like as for example Bakula also came in. So many artists who came in, they all uh, came and worked with their small effort, voluntary effort, and we have been that way existing since so many years. Though all of us, whoever the members, we all also works for other things, for our own practice or our jobs. So this is one part which we all just do for our passion for continuing, and we mostly work for young artists and helping and promoting a dialogue with the young artist. And kind of events that we have been doing are, of course, talk is the basic part. And we started that format from our living room in Dwarka when we just started in 2014-15. And since then, we have collaborated with other galleries or organization to host those talks, events, and also we did exhibitions and studio visits of senior artists where we tried taking young or student artists there. For example, we did studio visits of Arun Kumar Redji, Jagannath Panda, Veer Munshi, Iranna. So these studio visits there, we take young and student artists there. So, and other programs, of course, are always there, like exhibitions or talk presentations. So during this pandemic time, we started this Artexplore event where we are connecting to people from around the world, artist community, to keep the dialogue alive in this online format. And our idea is to connect with different artists and young curators also. Though, like the past session, whatever exhibitions or things did that I have curated or I hosted, but now I we want to also collaborate it with young curators. So that way it has been going successful. And thank you all for being here. So today, our guest for today is Bakula Nayak, who has completed her undergraduate in architecture and an MS in communication and design from Pratt Institute and Manhattan. She has worked with global brands such as L'Oreal, Mishaka, and Ralph Lauren. And Bakula's passion for collecting vintage paper fused with her love for imagining the life stories of people who own them translate into tangible works of art. So, Dipti will be elaborating more on her work and they will be discussing. And of course, Bakula will be also presenting her practice and will tell us her journey and her works. And she will be in conversation with Dipti Anand, who is a writer, editor, and a curator. She has an interdisciplinary Master of Arts degree in the humanities and social thought from the Center of Experimental Humanities at New York University, and a business degree from Boston College, and a certificate in creative writing from Exeter College, Oxford University. She writes poetry, fiction, essays on art, literature, culture, philosophy, and literary theory. And she has recently finished her debut novel. And currently, she is working with Vadera Art Gallery in New Delhi. So thank you and welcome Dipti and Bakula for today's session. And I'd like to hand over this to Dipti so that she can continue the conversation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to have this conversation with Bakula, whom I've gotten to know very well over the last few months and our brief working relationship so far. I am actually really excited about featuring some of her work in an upcoming show I've curated at Vadera Art Gallery, where I work, titled Memory, whose curatorial premise is metaphysically concerned with the nature of self-building. I'm personally very drawn to Bakula's art for many reasons. one of which is the strong element of textuality that I find resounds in her work. And it's not necessarily limited to her practice of working with found paper, which is what is so frequently discussed about her practice, but more so in her deliberate compositions and her evocative symbolism that we're going to learn more about today. And as a reader, I'm someone who is really drawn to this opportunity to kind of read an artwork more narratively rather than kind of have this visual confrontation. So to be able to read her work as a narrative in flux is to have a constellation of stories that one can keep going back to with repeated viewing. Bakula, do you have any introductory thoughts or should we jump in?
No, let's jump in. I'm good.
So one of the, I actually wanted to begin kind of at the beginning in a sense. With a lot of creatives, we always, on looking back retrospectively, we see that there are these early signs and experiences that kind of alert the self and people around you as well to this relationship with the arts that's unique and special, meaning, so to speak, that artists are artists long before they become such artists. And I'm kind of curious to know what were some of your early expressions like. And having worked in design, which I know that you were also passionate about for a brief period, do you consider that to be an interruption in your career or sort of necessary to finding your voice as an artist?
Actually, I think long before I made the connection, my mother did. I was very, very young when she, I think, noticed that and then I was interested in painting, and then she really pushed it. I don't think I left by myself. I might not have, I had too many interests in life, but then I started to focus because my mother was interested. And it was a time when, and she wasn't very educated herself, but she pushed me to think. And I'm amazed now when I look at it, because I'm just like, how did she think of that? And I think as an artist, when I was younger, I was much more bolder and much more current in what I painted, because somewhere, like I still remember in the 80s, when I was between 9 and 11, I was making paintings that were a statement on world affairs. So, I don't ever remember drawing those two little hills with the sun rising and a house. I don't even remember drawing that when I was young, because I was drawing things like Indira Gandhi's funeral, or I was making a statement on the American and Russian, I think there was a nuclear war peace treaty that happened. There was the famine in Ethiopia. So those were the kind of things I was painting about. And when you asked me that question was when it struck me that I was a lot more deeper then. And I can see it slowly coming back now, because when I was a teenager, my mom had terminal cancer, and then, I lost her. And somehow the impetus that was always there stopped being there. And we were all overcome with her illness. Then I had other things, college, boyfriends, and art just took a backseat. Like, it was never, and my father didn't think it was much of a career to begin with. I really wanted to go to the JJ School of Art, but they wouldn't. My family's goal was to get me married at 17. So there was no, so I couldn't leave town. So whatever options, and I studied architecture because that seemed reasonably like a professional that would allow you to be creative. But after 5 years, I realized my heart was just not in it. It just wasn't. And then I started with graphic design, which felt more like art. And although I enjoyed it, and it wasn't brief, that was like for a good 15 years, and I still design on and off. And I don't know if it, when I, at around 40, decided that I want, suddenly I was just done. And art called me. It was just one of those things. I just felt the need to paint because somebody said that they paint. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, I paint too. And then he said, oh, so show me what you did. And I remembered the last I painted was when I was 16. So actually I don't paint, but in my head, all these years I had been telling people I paint. So he looked at me like, oh, you don't paint. And that sort of became like, oh my God, I need to paint. And I started. And the easiest way to jump in, like, was the skills I already had. So between 5 years of architecture and that many years of design, my inking, my paperwork, my sketching, that was strong. And that was the easiest way to make that translation of career. And that's what I did. And I mean, pen and ink is still my strength, although I do try other mediums now. But somewhere in between, artist envy creeped in. Because when you see other artists who have studied art and they draw so easily, they do so, and I would go to all these camps or exhibitions or art, and then I would just look at it and be like, oh my God, I want to do that. So that became a hindrance. My envy became an hindrance because I wanted to do what everybody else was doing. I wanted to do paintings that were 5 feet by 6 feet. I wanted to add color. I wanted to do so many things. But I went through that phase for like a year. And I think I calmed down, like once that was out of my system. So right now, whatever I've studied before this has become my strength, and I learn to work with it and focus on it. Because even with those skills, I know there is so much more to do.
For sure, I can definitely see that, they all kind of act as visual languages. It just adds to your vocabulary then. So to be able to revisit it or to kind of bring it all together is, very confluent, and it's something that is very evident in your work. And the more we talk, the more I realize that, I love how you just kind of channel the world as like this interdisciplinary smorgasbord, and you're like, I'll take whatever I can get. I think that's a really lovely relationship to have with the world around you. And kind of speaking about your callings in that sense and just discovering your callings, one of we briefly mentioned vintage paper. I think it's something that's so discussed about your work, and the thing that I find fascinating is that it's actually not so much a love of aesthetics that leads you to collect it or work with vintage paper, but more your love of history. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about your relationship with history.
I collected these papers from when I was in school. So the papers just found an expression when I decided to paint. But really, I had been collecting it because when I see these old pieces of paper, it's like another world I enter. And, there are papers that a lot of people collect and has its own value, like rare maps, rare books. But then when I find, like in a flea market, or I go to like some of those bazaars in Cochin, and you find like these old letters from somebody, or there is a picture of a mother and a child, an old photograph. And I think about how there was so much love in this object, right? There was a time when photographs were so expensive to make, and they made this, but suddenly when you're dead, then all this is trash. Suddenly all your treasures are trash. And that, I don't know, for whatever reason, bothered me. And I would always hang on to it. I call myself the keeper of memories for other people, like these abandoned memories that I find everywhere else. I feel like there is so much love in it. And also it might stem from the fact that I don't have a sense of my own history. Like my parents passed away when I was young, and I didn't have grandparents. So I look for myself in these pieces of paper, and like this is a vintage paper I used, and like just seeing the calligraphy, right? Legal documents of like, this is one of my paintings, and this is in Tamil, I think, but there was there are reams and reams of legal paper I have with beautiful calligraphy writing, and I'm always like, somebody spent so much time and effort on this. Like, can you imagine writing 100-page court document in such beautiful writing? Like, I mean, look at it. It's so even, so neatly written. There isn't a scratch on it. And I feel like it needs its day in the sun. So when I have my art on it, somehow, like, I feel a lot more people relate to it. Like, otherwise it's just a legal paper. But now when I make this painting called In a Jam, people are looking at it and going, oh, like, that's funny. And then they make their own connections with it. So that sort of spreads the love. And I like that. And then if we see the next painting, that is actually somebody's journal that was written on a book. And when I was reading through it, he talks about, his daily life, and his wife was visiting, he was working somewhere else. So it is somebody's like record, and it's from 1907. So it's like a record of somebody's life from then. And now somehow it's relatable, it's more contemporary because of, I use animals and symbols and things like that to draw people in. And I feel like these papers have finally found that importance that I feel they should have. So I do use a lot of I love finding personal letters, like love letters. And it's just like, I'm so vicarious that way. Like when it's like, it's a part of your life that you're done with, or it's something you haven't experienced, you almost get to relive it again.
For sure. And I think that there's something very beautiful about this idea of, that you're so concerned with personal history, and this element that you see of relatability that comes about with your responsiveness to it, and then that you kind of then defer on to the next relationship, which is the viewer with you and your artwork. I feel like it's very special. And it makes me think of this relationship between personal history, collective history, and artistic expression, which kind of lies on some kind of, which is, a modality of individual expression, arguably, but it lies on a certain kind of spectrum. And I wonder, to that effect, you mentioned that you're very vicarious, it's like there's that whole element of play almost that exists in your relationship with these found letters. But how much of your work, once you start to respond to it, how much is it of you kind of responding to a narrative scene that you're building, which, more representational, where there's a certain kind of distance between you and the subject you're exploring, or elements like autobiographical elements that make their way into the composition?
Actually, initially when I started, it was mostly representational, because the very first drawing I made was on my father's letter, and that was between my father and my mother. So somehow that train of thought stuck with me. So every time I picked up a paper, it was what I wanted to tell about the paper. My art was about that paper. It was always about what's in there and who is going to look at this. Like I was never in it. And somehow over time, like when I did more works, I realized that people are the same. Like I could find myself in these very papers. Like, if it was a love letter, I had felt that feeling before. If it was a receipt for an ice cream bill, for instance, like, for ice cream, then the story I built was when I had that same experience with my children. Are we on? Dipti?
Yeah, I'm here, Bakula.
Oh, okay. It got
yeah, Dipti
frozen
is
for a
also
moment.
there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It just got frozen for a moment. Sorry.
Hi, is there any problem from Dipti's side?
Must be.
Yeah,
There she
she's
is.
there. Yeah.
I had a slight internet glitch, sorry, but I'm back, and sorry that must like cut you off.
No, it's all right. I was like, was I talking to myself?
No, I'm very much here.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say, that slowly I began to find myself in these papers, and then the story started to sort of be an overlap. It wasn't really representational, it wasn't really autobiographical, so there was always a mix. And over time, I think I'm getting bolder too, to talk about myself. And that's what, I mean, in the beginning was always representational, but now I am trying to make that effort. And also, it's also a release. I've realized over time that to talk about your own self is okay, and your own work is okay. And I think also graphic design sort of pushes you, right, to always think from the point of view of the viewer. So my works for 15 years haven't been about me. It's about the one looking at work. And so that's how I painted too. I always painted for the person looking at it. And then over time, I think when I suddenly fell ill, and then, there was all this angst in me, and that's when I started to attempt to sort of draw, to release my own feelings and my own pain. So I have made that journey now. But yeah, otherwise it was, I think now that I think about it, the more I focus on things that I feel and I do, the bolder I get with my work.
It's so interesting. I feel that a lot of in just a lot of different disciplines, there's such a impetus of wanting to express yourself in some way or to be present in your work, but so often the relationship with your art is such that you kind of feel concealed by it in some way. And I think that that's really interesting. There is definitely that interplay, and I do feel like it can exist on a spectrum for sure. Do you feel like there are specific is there a specific body of work that you feel maybe reads more autobiographically than representation?
I know the exact painting where I made that turn. So, I mean, I think it's on your slide, the one it's a song. I think there is a song. That's what it's called. And
can you see my screen?
Yes, there is a song. This was one of the first ones. Because I fell ill 3 years ago, and very severely ill. And I was bedridden. I couldn't move. I couldn't participate in life. There was nothing I could do. And I don't know what happened one day. I had these vintage papers with, the body figures on them. And it just felt like such a release to be able to draw these. And actually, at the same time, I was reading a book by K.G. Subramaniam. And he talks about how an artist paints something to feel it, to understand it. And I don't know, when I read it, it sort of came back to the painting that I made, because it was an attempt to understand my own body, my own pain. But once I did this, like if you see my earlier work where there is the bird, the flamingo, I mean, they're so happy. It's like all fantasy, and I realized, yes, and that was my escape from my pain. So I always painted my escape. I did the fantasy, but this was the first time, I think, even escaping into fantasy wasn't enough. Like I was in so much pain that escape didn't help. And when I did this, I was so self-conscious because this isn't my work. It didn't feel like me to me. Although I liked doing it and it made me feel a release, it wasn't my work. And then I showed it to a couple of friends who are not artists, but, close to me, and they just laughed in my face and they were like, what is this? And then when you are already unsure, you're an artist who is not you're self-taught, you're just in this little space. And then I was so awkward about this for a very long time that it just stayed hidden. Then at one point I did take it to Vadera, and Roshni looked at it. And when I explained my hesitation, she was so nice. She was surprised that I was even hesitated. She was like, you're an artist. You paint what you feel like, and that's when I think a whole nother world opened up to me. That's the point where I realized, oh my God, I'm an artist. I paint for myself. Why am I so worried about, I would think, who would buy a sad painting? Who wants to, those were my questions, because I came from a very different world. And once that barrier broke, I have been so much more, I'm still awkward, but I don't hesitate to paint this anymore. I don't hesitate to face my pains and my fears head on, because I've realized that facing them gives me so much more relief than this escape into fantasy that I was doing. I still do both. So it's like a very, it's like two completely different people painting. But that's how my life is. Because if you look at me, you can't tell how sick I am. You can't tell that my life is at a standstill. but there is that part of me. So, and there is this other part that always looks happy, that always looks like everything is fine. So I feel like my art has also made that sort of divide in itself.
It's interesting that you describe it as a divide, because to me it just sounds like a reconciliation more than anything, which is what I think is so,
Oh,
yeah.
that's such a nice thing to say. It probably is. It probably is. To me, in my heart, it is. But I think for random people looking at the works, it just feels like there is.
I've seen this particular work at the gallery, and it's stunning. I know that there's a counterpart, also very similar, second work that kind of pairs very well with it.
Yeah.
But
yeah, we have one more in, I think, the presentation, which was, yeah.
So kind of, just exploring just the idea of, if we look at the self as this site of meaning, so to speak. I am very curious to know more about your relationship with symbolism, which I know you're no stranger to. One of my favorite things from one of our chats has been that you told me once that you've never painted a flower just because it's a flower. And that really stayed with me. So I was like, I have to mention that today.
Thank you.
And if we're talking about concealing, which we were a few minutes ago, oftentimes I feel like, in a conversational way, we could say that sometimes symbolism is considered like a method of concealment, right? Like you're hiding what really means something inside something else. And if you can get it, you get it. But I actually feel like it's very revealing about your work, because it kind of, you start to build this understanding of what your personal vocabulary is. And I think that really, the more you know it, the more it enriches your interaction with, like our interaction with your work. And I'd love to know, a little bit more about that. Are there certain symbols for you that stay very potent, that you keep returning to? Yeah.
So, like, if you look at that previous painting we just showed, where the cactus and the woman is lying on the cactus, I mean, right away you do get what it means, right? She's sleeping despite the cactus. But cactus has a symbolism of like endurance, of life despite all harsh conditions. So those are the kind of like things I like to infuse. Like, you can get it right away even if you never knew the symbolism, but for me it means something to have these layers. So like the hen, for instance, shows maternal love. Like, so there are some paintings where I think of my mother sometimes, or I think of the feeling of motherhood, and that's the easiest way for me to express myself. Like, and then so, or the two symbols that show up a lot in my work is the tea and paper boat. And tea, and the thing is, like, I'm always about kindness in this world, and I think now more than ever, like, I mean, kindness means something. I don't know, we have gotten to a point. I mean, I started this 4 years ago and I didn't even, like, it wasn't this bad. Like, right now I just feel like people have forgotten how to be kind. People have forgotten how to be on two different sides of the fence and still be nice to each other. I mean, I think there was a period in time when people knew how to do that. Now it's either you're on my side or you're not. And like, the divide has deepened into families, into circles of friends, and
you have to,
I don't know, that to me. Yeah. So tea for me is a big symbol of, hanging out, sitting together. And it's a universal symbol of peace and harmony, sort of, like, if you look up the meanings. But tea also has like sexual connotations for me. That's a personal thing. So sometimes it shows up as that. And one of the other symbols, like they're both in that cactus drawing and another drawing that we have in the presentation, is the paper boats. Paper boats are symbolic of life, that, not everything exists the way it is. Like, we live like we're going to live for 100 years. Like, we're going to hate this thing forever and do this forever. It's fragile. And I think the paper boat reminds us of that it's eventually going to sink. It's going to float for as long as it is, but it will sink. And then, so that to me is symbolic of life, the paper boat. And sometimes I add, a lot of the times, not sometimes, I add that little love flag on it, again, as a reminder for kindness, like in your life. And so that's just my little way of spreading this message in the world, that we need to remember to be kind.
Do you like some, from what you just shared, it seems like you at certain times ascribe your own meaning. You kind of construct the symbol and say, henceforth, this is what it means. And sometimes you're kind of like, you also research extensively, like how it's been used by other artists, or in other like any historical references, because that can
Yeah,
also
I
kind
do. I do. I mean, some symbols are personal, but some, like, sometimes I do look up, like, what does this symbolize? Like, or if I want to symbolize innocence, then can I make, like, I will look up meanings, but I don't necessarily look at other artists to look for how they have used the same symbol, because I look at it, I think, more from a point of, would someone else get it if I didn't say it?
of.
Yeah, so
I think I thought I'll take this moment to inform everybody. For some reason, it says that our meeting might end in a couple of minutes. So I would love for everybody to just come back on that link that was shared. I'm not really sure why that's happening, but hopefully we can make it
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, you can rejoin with the same ID and password. It maybe in 2 to 3 minutes it may get
I think it's
disconnected.
about
So
3 minutes. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
you
what it
can
says.
continue the discussion for now. Yeah, thank you.
Um, so yeah, sorry, that was a bit so yeah, when we're talking about, so yeah, I get that, because I feel like there is that rendering of a personal touch to what one could argue, maybe there are no universal symbols, or symbols are subjects that are treated universally. There's like so many ways to kind of construct that conversation.
and also, sorry, no, go
No,
ahead.
yeah.
I was just going to say, sometimes the same thing means different things in different cultures.
Yeah.
Or in different contexts. So yeah, that always exists. But when I'm seriously now, it has gotten to a point where I'm painting, I have become selfish. Like, I think less about the viewer now, which I'm so excited about, because this is something that happened to me a few months ago, like at the beginning of the year. So I am very excited with the discovery that I'm an artist. I can paint for myself. I don't have to. But for 15 years, I have painted for someone else. Like, I've designed for someone else. And that's a habit that was hard to break. And now that I've broken it, I think I'm reveling in it, and that it doesn't matter what it might mean or not mean. Yeah.
I'm glad that you're sharing it. It's very authentic to actually share to share this aspect of the process, because I think a lot of times people consider it to be such a immediate and spontaneous relationship, but it's not. It's a struggle. It's like you're birthing a part of yourself. Sometimes you look at it and you're like, is this me? Can I recognize it? Or this really is me, but will anybody else believe it? There's so many layers of
It is.
trying to connect with yourself. So when you have a moment like this where you're able to kind of align, I think it should be celebrated. So I'm glad that you
Yeah.
are experiencing it so joyfully.
Thank you.
In fact, I feel like it's literally saying less than a minute. So instead of jumping into the next question, I think that we could just maybe kind of sign back on to the new session. That works. I wouldn't want to cut you off.
Yeah. Okay. Or, I mean, you're saying we just log out and log back in?
Yeah, if everybody would be willing
Yeah.
to do that.
No, let's
Great.
both hang out. But
Yeah.
if everybody, yeah, everybody left, I think. No, people are still on.
There.
Okay. I guess, is it where are you seeing that it, oh yeah, it says less than a minute.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
guess we can end and just sign back in.
Okay, I'll just
Yeah.
leave the meet and disconnect.
Yeah.
We were still on the topic of symbolism, and we were talking about kind of just how it's rendered in different vocabularies. Interestingly, the thought just came to me of thinking of symbolism as a form of handwriting. I mean, I know that a lot of artists, like not everybody employs it, and some people are very vehemently like, my work is not symbolic, but which is totally fine. I think that's a form of handwriting as well. But so just kind of in that vein, thinking about another artist who you've really, whose work you really responded to, is Frida Kahlo. And I bring her up because we've discussed her movie, which we both love. And we could say that her main artistic currency was also emotion, more specifically the varieties of pain that she felt, because she lived a very, very difficult life. But I was very fascinated to learn that you had, in responding to her work, had created a transformative series of your own, also distinctly different from your previous work. And I'd love for you to kind of take us through your state of mind with this, series of work, and how it kind of relates to your relationship with symbolism, and why it stands so distinctly from your other body of work.
So basically, it was at the same point when I was bedridden. I had completely lost, all interest in life. I had completely given up. Like, I couldn't even sit up for like a half hour. And so that meant I couldn't paint. That meant I couldn't look after my children. I couldn't look after myself, my house. And to feel that at 40 is really a slap in your face, because you still think you're young, you have so much of life ahead of you. And it just felt really bleak. Like I felt like my life had ended because there was nothing I could do other than lying on the bed. And at this point, it was my birthday, and two of my friends bought me, they asked me what I wanted. And I said, okay, what else am I going to do? I can only read. So I was like, why don't you get me some art books? And these were two clueless boys who just went into town and just brought me a ton of books. And surprising, I had like something like 20 books by they're my best friends. And yeah. One of the books was a diary of Frida Kahlo. It had her sketches, it had like, the English translations. And I don't know, the diary was what spoke to me. Like I'm one of those people that anyway relates first to words. And once I started reading it, I don't know why I hadn't heard of her until then. I mean, I had heard of her, but it wasn't something I had actively pursued. And then I started to look up stuff and learn. And then I realized here was this woman who was so sick that my sickness was nothing compared to that. And she went on to do so much with her life, even though she was suffering. I mean, and then when I looked at her work, it was all so painful. She painted her pain, but physically she always looked well, or that's the image she portrayed, this very vibrant. Yes. And so I was like, wow, so it is possible, right? That if you are sick, you just need the will. That's what I realized. If she was painting, lying down in bed with a mirror on top of her to see what she looks like, I mean, that is some effort. And I was like, I'm not even in that kind of a situation. And that completely woke me up. But then when I started seeing her work and how painful it was, I was still in that escape into my fantasy mode at that point. Now I appreciate painting your pain. I was like, and then I looked at aspects of her life where she had, like, for instance, she had this painting called Me and My Doll, which she painted when she had a miscarriage and she really wanted to have kids. And so there is this empty hospital bed and she sits on one side and there is a doll on the other end of the bed. And it's a very haunting painting. And then when I had read about her life, I figured there were so many more children that she really loved. And she did have that maternal feeling, and that's something she shared with her sister's kids. There is a little boy that shows up in a lot of her photographs who might have been someone from her neighborhood. She had a lot of pet animals. So I was like, she never painted that part of her. So I took a series of her works that were all painful and then not printed, sorry. So I painted happier versions of those same paintings. So this was Me and My Doll, but Frida in her happier state, actually experiencing that maternal feeling. So that's how I did this series of, and that's when I think I also caved into some of my color envy. Like up until then, I wasn't doing a lot of color, but Frida somehow like allows you, right? It has to be colorful, it has to be loud. And that's when I did some of that.
It's so interesting also to kind of have if she's so entrenched in wanting to depict pain, but then to use such a vibrant color palette to do it, almost, everyone talks about happiness being in Technicolor, but it's interesting that, um, that pain, I mean, it runs just as deep. It does have a very vibrant color palette. Maybe we wouldn't use the word vibrant, but yeah, in that sense. But you mentioned Frida Kahlo's diaries, and I know that you're also a very avid reader in general, and you read a lot of autobiographies, and your relationship with text, you've kind of shared with us about, loving to intercept correspondences in a playful way, or archiving, or just being interested in, I think you mentioned once to me, like buying books at a garage sale and then flipping them open to see what someone's left behind, or like an old library book. I so kind of wanted to maybe just discuss in a more from a more like artist practice kind of point of view, that how do you kind of sort through, catalog these inspirations, if that's a fair kind of question to ask, in terms, and like take this interdisciplinary nature of text, or this textual quality, and then kind of marry it to your visual language.
My appreciation for text, I think, started at Pratt when I was studying design. We had a typography class, and we had several typography classes, and the goal of the class was to appreciate the beauty of the form of each letter. So you start from there. So you look at an uppercase A, you look at a lowercase a, you look at how they, and I fell in love. I really did. Like, for instance, if you look at the lowercase a in Helvetica versus Arial versus, like, I can tell. And some of them I feel like are sexy. Like, I mean, who would think like a lowercase a is sexy? I do. But that's just, the love for letters just grew then. And then we had exercises where text was not used just to communicate as words. They were used as texture. They were used as, shapes. They were used as, and so I think the appreciation for letters text came in there. And so sometimes, although my work is, like sort of like a representation of like a story that's in the letter, sometimes I also use it for what it is, like for the beauty, for the texture that these texts create. So in that sense, the words have more than one meaning for me. Like, other than just reading the letter, it's also the aesthetic of the person that wrote it, and seeing all that beautiful handwriting. And like, I'm especially fascinated by handwriting. Like when you see in ledger books, in, legal papers, I'm like, I cannot imagine. Like today, I mean, my 14-year-old the other day is like, can you imagine? I have to write this paragraph, is what he said. And I was like, really? Like, because they don't even know what it is to write a paragraph in school. And to think of a time and I'm sure it was a busy time. Like if you're in court, isn't it a busy time to fill 100 pages with your handwriting? But somebody took pride in it. And I think those are the things that appeal to me, that, that here was this someone who took pride and love and did this, and now I can't throw it. Like I can't throw that paper. And so I think that's why I hang on to it. And graphic design for 15 years has definitely built my love for letters and words.
That's it's so interesting, because it's like what I'm hearing is this reciprocity almost, right? We're talking about the construction of the word, and then we're talking about the narrative of the composition, and it just kind of reinforces to me like this textual relationship. And I mean, that's why I personally so connect with your work so much, because I'm a huge reader, and as a writer too, it's just kind of the modality with which you hinge onto the world, I guess. But very powerfully, in fact, I want to talk about your work with Sangam literature from Tamil Nadu, which you actually presented at Habitat Center in Delhi in 2017, which was kind of like a jugalbandi, which is usually of like music and storytelling, but you elevated it to include visual art. I think there were dance elements as well. And I would love for you to share just kind of like conceiving those interrelationships, and what was it like to kind of present it to an audience, a live audience?
Actually, it all started with, I had been to a cultural center in Hyderabad called Saptaparni, and they have a library. And I don't know why, I randomly picked one book off the shelf and I read it in one night. It was poetry from, like, I don't know, like 3,000-4,000 years ago. And it was beautifully translated. And as I was reading it, there was this, like, sometimes it happens to me that I get obsessed with something, and the only way I can release that emotion is by drawing. Like, I have to draw it and be done. Otherwise, I get so obsessed that I can't focus on anything else in my life. And I woke up one day with the idea that I was going to paint this. And as I was painting it, I realized that it was also music, because this was from a composer. He was called Tyagaya. And as I started to do this, then I talked to Anuradha Gunupati. She owns Saptaparni and she is into music. So she was explaining to me how he was a composer, he had music. And I was like, oh, there's this other element. So can we explore it? So, there is my language and then there is this musical language. So she was so supportive of the idea, because I was also afraid. Like, when you touch things like ancient Indian literature, when you're touching someone so revered, like in the beginning, I didn't know. But as I talked to her, I realized how revered he was. And apparently all his music happens in 3-hour concerts. And so to do this where it was casual, and I am casual, like, I'm not claiming to be an expert, but to do that was scary. But the fact that she supported me, and there were people who took offense to it. Like, when I posted about it, they were like, oh, you shouldn't be doing it to his compositions. But the way I look at it as crossing barriers of language. Like, his compositions are in a language I don't understand. So the fact that there was English translations, the fact that I do it with my birds, bring this modern language into it, and visual language doesn't need you to understand anything. So I was thinking crossing barriers and making it accessible. Like, and I was thinking of my own children. I had just moved from the US to India at that point. And so to me, there was like, when you live with it, you don't appreciate it so much. And then that's the reason that I started it. And then with Sangam, that's what happened. Again, it was poetry from 5,000 years ago. And you will realize humans love the same way, hate the same way. Like, I'm reading a poem from then, and I can see the love story that happens in that poem is the exact love story I had when I was a teenager. So if we go to that painting, which is Life is a Ride, you will see, like, it was inspired by a poem where they talk about how the doors in the villages have lost their hinges because the young girls keep throwing them open to see the handsome prince, and the mothers keep shutting them. And this was something that had happened to me, because when I was a teenager, there was this boy in my neighborhood who'd go every day at 8 a.m. to buy bread. And I would stand by the window waiting for him because I could see him. And my mother would appear and just draw the curtains at the exact same time. So to think that this thing had happened 5,000 years ago, and it's your life, I mean, that is amazing. And a lot of Sangam poetry is lost. So it was my little bit to introduce Sangam poetry to a completely different new audience. And I worked at, I don't know why at that point, I had already done a couple with musicians. And I was like, why don't we add dance to this? And the Habitat Center actually put me in touch with Vasudev Iyengar, who was brilliant. I mean, there is a clip on YouTube of this thing. Like, if you do Bakula Nayak Sangam literature, it will show up. But he actually danced my painting. So he danced this whole painting in Bharatanatyam. So, and working with him, like, I got his perspective. And to do this where you cross over, like, music, dance, art, storytelling, history, I just totally, I mean, to me, it's so fulfilling that so many more people, and I'm one of those people, when I get excited about something, I want the whole world to know. So this was sort of like my medium of expressing my joy at having found that there is so much of ancient Indian literature that is so interesting and so current. Just because it's 5,000 years old doesn't make it redundant. So that's the story behind. that one.
I love that, because I feel like there shouldn't, I mean, and not to make a blanket statement, but, is there an hierarchy of inspiration? Should there be one? Because I feel like, you're taking something that, like you described, is, so lost, and there's not a contemporary interaction with it outside, let's say, maybe a small insular group of people, maybe academics, or extremely, people who are just like following the breadcrumbs very specifically. But to kind of just bring it open into a conversation, and then not only, I feel like, in the fashion of content, but also through form, and then having all these different art forms like work off, translate each other. I think that would have been very special to watch. I don't know what I was doing that day in 2017, but
Yeah, it
yeah.
was an experience. It was an experience. I totally enjoyed it.
um Kind of just talking about this is interesting, because I feel like now we're at this point where we're moved away from the viewer's relationship with your work, and we're looking at your relationship with art in general, that of other artists. We've talked a lot about your relationship with your own practice, and I'm going to ask you one of my favorite questions, that I'm also kind of in the search for in my life, is whether you've had an experience with another artist's work, that, or found a painting, let's say, that you were so moved by emotionally, that, it brought about like a reaction, like maybe tears, or just a very profound emotion that you could be like, I felt that in that moment.
In a general sort of way, like for 25 years, I lived in Bangalore. I grew up there. My parents were very conservative. We didn't have holidays. We didn't go anywhere. And then I got married, and my husband loves to travel. And whatever I want to see, he's all like, let's go. So it would be a show in Paris and we could go. Like, this was when we didn't have kids and we were by ourselves. But, I could pick anything and we could go. And one of those times, I know we had been several trips to Europe, and the sheer beauty of painting, the skill involved in making it. I mean, it was tremendous. The feelings that would surge, that there were all these people who laid this path out for me. If they weren't artists, I wouldn't be called an artist today. That would move me. Like, seeing Miro's museum. Like my kids looked at it and they were like, I can do this. What is this?
I hate when people say that. Yeah.
But when a 7-year-old says it loudly in the museum, but it's a chance to explain to him that today I can be an artist because he made it art. Up to that point, those things weren't called art. So for me, these are always chances to involve my kids who are more sporty than artistic. And that always moves me to see skill, to see a story. But one that completely rendered me like to tears was when I saw this show by Lucian Freud. I didn't know him at all. It was a show at the Frieze, New York, I think 2 years ago. And no, a year ago. And and there were these gigantic canvases of oversized, like, they were huge people. And there was this one painting called Big Sue. And this woman is huge and obese. And I was having several body issues at the same time because of my illness. I had gained so much weight. I mean, it's a feeling I can't shake off, and you don't feel beautiful anymore. And here was this painting that should have been gross, but it was fantastic. Like if you see Lucian Freud's work, it just makes you believe in the beauty of being a human, just having a body. And I wouldn't believe it, right? You hear it all the time. Oh, humans should be loved in any shape, any color, any form. But really, when you look at when I look at my own body, I would not feel good about it. But here was this body that was, anybody would have called gross, but he had made it beautiful. It really brought me to tears. And I think that's the time I understood that the shape of my body didn't matter. So, I mean, that really moved me, that show. And I do love his work a lot.
That's also another example of how something that's historical just becomes so relevant, again, just kind of like it's being represented I don't know how many times that particular work was presented to the public, but the fact that it's just, there's so much talk about, one's relationship with the body shaming, body image and stuff, that it becomes these stories, I feel like, have been around for such a long time, which, in fact, kind of takes us to another place where I was very curious to discuss with you. Is this relationship between art and larger conversations of public life? How much of art, is there pressure to kind of explore the political in the personal, or to respond to current events, or to accept that your work may be viewed aesthetically in one period of time and may be viewed politically at another? And more importantly, can it function self-sufficiently, or does it need to be discursive with public life?
For the longest time, I thought it didn't need to be. And I am one of those sit on the fence kind of people. Like, I'm non-confrontational, and I by nature try to see the other person's side. So even if I think this is right and you are thinking wrong, I can see your side. That's how I am as a person. So for me, it has always been like, oh, that person has a reason why they're doing that. But I think in the last couple of years, it has reached a point where you cannot, as a human being, forget as an artist, you cannot accept these things. Like, I mean, I cannot accept it to myself. I can't be okay with it. Then I'm thinking, what's the message I'm sending my children? To live with this kind of thing, to live with this kind of like inequality, and sometimes there's so much angst and frustration, because what do? You can't do anything, right? Like, I mean, you do your part, you go on rallies, you donate, but really change is in the hands of someone else when we all come together. And the easiest way to get on with life while I feel this frustration is to paint about it. So, and now after my recent, taking a stand, and there have been several strong women that I've looked up to, that make a point without insulting the other side, that make a point without lashing out at someone, but to say this is right and this is what we need to do as a society, as as one. And there are so many who are on the side of humanity, if I can say that, the atrocities that we see, like, I just feel like there is enough of us rising against it and making my art that makes a statement about it. Like, there is one, I think, in our presentation where I was on holiday and this whole NRC, CA protests were going on. And, I should have been on holiday and enjoying that, but I really couldn't. It was just so much in my head. And the fact that so many people were rising up to it just was so hopeful. Like, I feel hopeful for my children when something like that happens. And, and at the same time, we were on the beach and there were kids of every country. I don't know, we were in Mexico, but there were kids from England, there were kids from Australia, there were kids from Africa, there was my son, and they were all playing soccer. And I saw them, right? They were helping each other. They were helping the kids win. And, when the other team lost, the one child from this team went to that one to console him because he was a small boy. And that gave me so much hope for the future. And I feel like children have this. Where does it go when we become adults? Like, that really affects me. This kind of, I don't know what you call it. Like, you don't care for another person. Like, I have people like that in my own circle and I'm amazed. These were people, I mean, there wasn't a chance to talk about it. And then I feel that the people that are violent always have a voice, versus the ones who want peace, our voices are not heard. And I had to, at that moment, draw this. This was in my sketchbook and it was something I felt so strongly about. And now I'm slowly finding my artistic voice that makes a political statement, which I have shied away from a very long time. And the other painting that you see is on gender pay gap. Like, I didn't even know that existed. And this March, there was a gender pay gap day. And I was like, wow, like, I didn't even realize how big the issue is. So this painting came out of that. And, again, I use symbolism here where the fiddle leaf fig tree grows on another tree and takes all the sunshine, and then you don't see the host plant to begin with. So I feel like men in the world get all the sunshine in the corporate world, right? Like, I mean, I've been there, so I know it. And even amongst artists, I do see it a lot of the times. And, the men have more recognition, more pay, and, and then the women get hidden in this. And so this was a whole series that came about. And the show is going to be at, I did this painting for a women's museum in Bonn. And they were looking at how COVID has affected women. And apparently the gender pay gap has worsened with the pandemic setting in. So this was one of those.
A response to that. In fact, where I just, you mentioned COVID, and I just wanted to touch on that briefly because I feel like a lot of people are very curious also about how art responds to a digitization of relationships between, for example, us even, having this kind of initiative is also to kind of keep dialogue going. How your relationships with institutions, galleries, do you think that is that somehow being enhanced by this kind of forced digital connection that makes distances, dissolves distances, so to speak?
For me, this is a stopgap thing. I'm so old school. I want to go see my painting. I want to touch people. I want to hug people. I want to thank people for coming to my, that's me. But in the year that there's probably going to be another year, I cannot be without access to art. And I think in that sense, this has been awesome that so many people have come together. We have so many online versions of things. And that way I also have less FOMO. Like otherwise I'm always thinking I'm missing out on something. This is the one time you're not missing out on anything.
Multiple screens and attend, simultaneously.
Yeah, you can. So yeah. So in that sense, I think for me, this is an arrangement that I will make do with. But once the actual things open up, I'm running to every museum I can.
I completely agree with that. I don't think that I could want to live without the, having some kind of touch and feel with the outside world and other people either. Yeah. So I would love to actually to open it up to some questions if anybody has any for Bakula. If you like, you could just unmute yourself or, just send something in the chat box and I can ask it for you as well. Okay, well, I guess that we were very comprehensive then and there are no questions.
Yeah. I think so. Like Dipti has very well curated the whole conversation. So there is not much question. Like you have touched all the aspects so nicely, and the discussion was very enriching. But still, I'm just asking a simple question to Bakula, like about the papers that you used. So, do you, is there how the way you choose the papers? Is there anything that you look at, like these are the papers I want to work on? How do you do that? And is there any treatment also required, technical treatment to preserve or work on those papers?
Actually, I just have so much paper that when I have a new show, or sometimes it is something that I want to express, right? Like, so, like if I want a love letter, then I will look for a love letter. But sometimes, most times I just go through my papers and just pick out what speaks to me. Like, I'm like, oh, that's an interesting piece, or like, this looks good. And then I take out all my papers. And, honestly speaking, the papers from 100 years ago and the inks are so much better than anything we find now. Like they are so strong, like and these were not even meant to be painted upon, but they take paint so well. But there are times when I do bigger works and I used to give it to Intact to get it restored. like maps and stuff. And then once it's restored, I paint on it. But otherwise, I usually just sun them. I spray them sometimes just to make sure there are no bugs or anything like that. But yeah, these papers actually have already lasted 100 years. I think they will last 100 more, honestly.
Yeah. Right. And the text, the things that written on those papers, do you try to relate to those things also in your imagery?
Yes, I do. Actually, that's where my story starts. Like, what is on the paper. I very rarely use it as a decorative element. So my story does start from that.
Right. Right. Thank you. Thank you. So anything that Deepti you wants to say before we end today? It was
Oh,
really
just that, thank you for having us. Thank you for having me. I love chatting with Bakula. It was really fun to be able to share what we consider to be our insightful discussions on art with everyone. And thanks everyone for
And thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining at this. Like there was a good crowd, in fact, in the first half, though we missed some of them in the second time. But it was a great. I think there is a comment from someone. It was a great feeling to be able to connect with your work, Priyanka Sinha. She has sent a message. And
Yes.
yeah, and I have been seeing Bakula's work in social media, and I really love your imagery and the stories that you kind bring in. Uh, so it was really nice to know about your practice. And as I mentioned, Dipti has very well curated the whole conversation, and there were so many things you all both brought in to understand your journey and your art practice. And this whole conversation is recorded, of course, and we will put it in the YouTube and share with both of you, and as well as in our social media platform. So those who can't attend today, you can share with them. And thank you everyone, and we will keep posting for our next session or this session video also in our social media. You can keep connecting to us, and thank you to know Dipti personally through this platform. Thank you, Bakula, to bring in Dipti,
Thank
and
you.
yeah, thank you to
Yeah.
know and connect.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
thank
bye
you.
everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, good night.